Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. Today, I am speaking with Elizabeth Arnott, whose book, The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives, is many things. It's a thriller, it's a fun beach read, and it's told from an unusual perspective. The wives of serial killers. Not the men who have done the killing, but the women who have lived with them, slept next to them night after night, and had no idea what their husbands were up to. If I got your attention, the title and the premise certainly got mine. Set in the mid-1960s during a sweltering summer in Los Angeles, a series of young, pretty women are killed. Who better to solve the crime than three close friends, Margot, Elsie, and Beverly, who have one thing in common, a dark secret they are ashamed about, but that gives them an edge in the case. All three were married to serial killers. This book is suspenseful and became more so with every page. I read the book on a flight from California to New York and was completely engrossed. Elizabeth, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could join us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that lovely summary of the book as well. You captured it really well.
Thank you. So I read that prior to this novel, you had written two historical fiction books, but yet you've always been fascinated by serial killers. Can you tell us a bit about that fascination?
Yes.
Have you ever met a serial killer?
Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe. maybe you have too. You just don't know it yet.
Exactly.
Yes. So I have previously written two historical fiction novels under my maiden name, Lizzie Pook. But for as long as I can remember, in adulthood, I've been fascinated by true crime like so many of us are. Even back in university, I did my dissertation on serial killers, much to the horror of my tutor, who was terrified that I would write to some serial killers in prison for research or things like that. Because this was 20-something years ago. This was a time when true crime wasn't really the thing that it is now. It wasn't as commonplace. It was a bit more exotic. And, ever since then, I've always been fascinated by the way that a murderer's mind works, everything to do with murderers and particularly serial killers. There's something very tantalizing and very scary about serial killers that makes us want to know everything about them. So I hadn't, my previous novels weren't about serial killers. They weren't really sort of true crime adjacent. They were historical fiction, but they did have crimes in them. And then it was when I came to write this novel, and I'm sure we'll delve into the circumstances around that I finally was able to bring my own sort of real obsession with serial killers and true crime into the writing process, which was very satisfying.
So you set the book 1966, sun-drenched California. I'm from California originally. I'm wondering, we've had some serial killers there, definitely in California. But so how did you pick that place and that time?
Multiple reasons. So I did think about potentially setting the book in the UK, but I thought there was probably, California was a bit more appealing than writing about serial killers in Slough or Wiltshire or something like that here in the UK. Also, with California, you have a huge state where there is this sort of logistical probability of multiple serial killers operating at the same time. And I set this in 1966 because of lovely aesthetic reasons. It was enjoyable to write about the 60s. You've got the coal-lined eyes, the classic cars, the movies, the music. But 1966, going into the late 60s, early 70s, that was a time when serial killers were starting to become known as a sort of cultural concept. They weren't called serial killers at that time. They weren't called serial killers until the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was set up in the early 70s. They would have been known as things like mass killers or multiple killers or things like that. But the idea of this repeat killer was starting to seep into the public consciousness, starting to appear on the front page of newspapers. People were starting to lock their doors at night and sort of beware of this bogeyman thing. And there are multiple reasons as to why people think that was a real boom time in serial killer activity, sort of coming into the 70s. things like the countercultural movement meant that there were more people out and about moving around anonymously. It was sort of, there's a slight victim blaming edge to it, but it was easier to become a victim to a serial killer at that point because people were taking drugs and drinking and moving around a lot. But then you also have things like, there's the argument that men who are coming of age at that time were born to fathers who fought in the wars, in the First World War.
Right.
And therefore were perhaps a product of a more difficult upbringing and uneven upbringing and difficult circumstances at home. There are so many different theories as to why there were so many serial killers then. And then obviously we didn't have forensics, CCTV, the advances in policing that we have now. So I really wanted to tap into that sort of boom time in serial killer activity. But I also wanted to place my 3 housewives, in inverted commas, in the middle of these crimes and have them sort of scoop the FBI's behavioral science unit, beat them at their game. They hadn't started profiling yet, but my 3 women who had been married to serial killers, who had gone through the trauma of that and gained that experience, it was sort of a joke to myself and to other women to have them profiling killers and solving these crimes before the FBI did.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that brings me to something else. Yeah, you mentioned that the behavioral science unit wasn't formed until the 70s. So was it tricky, since they hadn't come up with profiling, to think of what these wives were going to think of? So it didn't look like a true crime show from today, but it was from the 60s. It was that kind of profiling before profiling was done.
It was tricky. And I had to look into things like, what did people say about psychopathy and psychopaths at that time? What was the language used around killers at that time? But because my women's experience was so immediate, they had access to the things that the FBI were trying to get access to. The FBI would try and get access to these men to interview them, to see what made them tick and why they did what they did. My women had lived with them for 10, 15 years. They'd cooked them dinner. They'd slept in a bed with them. They already had that knowledge. So it was a nice balance.
Is it true that most wives don't know that their husbands are serial killers in real life? Or do you know that is actually the case?
Yes, that is the case. And I mean, there are a very, very small number of wives who do know, a very, very small number of wives who are involved as well, and they become these killer couples. But the majority of people whose husbands, partners commit violent crime, they can't know what is going on. And if you speak to experts, and I've interviewed forensic psychologists, people who've sort of sat eyeball to eyeball with serial killers and serial killers' spouses, they will tell you that more often than not, a serial killer has traits of psychopathy, sociopathy, and they are incredibly adept at 1, manipulation, and 2, compartmentalization. And that means that they are able to live a whole and full life outside of their serial killer existence. So they will see, and I'm speaking, I'm sort of speaking secondhand from people that I've interviewed. They will see themselves as a good father, a good husband, an excellent person to be around in the home. And that is one identity. And then when they go out in their leisure time and they kill, that is an entirely separate identity, and they see them as 2 different things. And that is why serial killers are so interesting, because they can live those multiple identities and move in and out of one another quite seamlessly. Dennis Rader, who called himself BTK, it's the acronym for bind, torture, kill, he called it cubing. So he would talk about, turning the face of the cube out to display what identity he was going to be that day or that moment, what personality he was going to be in that day or one moment. And he was a father, he was a scout leader. He was a member of the church. He was married for 30-something years. They had kids.
Jesus.
And, he when he was interviewed after the fact, would talk about being able to move between these different personalities and these different identities. And also, I think it's important to remember that no human being no woman. But no human being is immune to being coercively controlled or manipulated or lied to, no matter how intelligent, how bright, how, emotionally intuitive we might think that we are. Nobody is immune to being conned.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what these women have been by their husbands. There are serial killers' wives who are attorneys. The wife of the Golden State Killer, she was an attorney, Sharon Huddle. And you think, and she didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
And we touched on this before we started recording.
Yeah.
When I went into writing this book, I think I probably held some sort of subconscious prejudice about these women. I think I thought deep down, oh, they didn't know. But if my husband was doing it, I would definitely know. I think I went into it thinking that. And then as I started writing, as I started researching a lot more and knowing my women and knowing more about the real life women who've been in this situation, I completely changed my mind. I think it's very, very easy not to know what's going on. And the partner of Ted Bundy, he had a long-term girlfriend and he actually lived with her and her daughter. So they all lived together. And she has said, people have said to her, how did you not know what was going on? You knew something was up. She knew something wasn't quite right. She knew something was fishy. But, she's been known to have said there was just no context for it. It would have been such a huge leap for her brain to go to, my husband's up to something and I think he's out killing people. Many women think, my husband's lying to me or my husband's having an affair. Quite often, if you look into it, these women, once they think, their husbands are lying to them, think therefore he must be having an extramarital affair. It's such a huge leap to think my husband's not telling me the truth. Therefore, he's out killing women. It's such a rare circumstance. It's such an unusual circumstance. But yes, I certainly changed my mind on that.
Oh my God. Okay. So can you read that part of your book that deals with this?
Yeah, it's just a short passage. It's Beverly recalling what it was like to be judged by her neighbors when they found out what was going on with her husband.
If you're enjoying this, please do hit subscribe wherever you're listening. It's usually just a button on the screen, and it means new episodes come straight to your inbox. It also really helps the show grow, which means more conversations like this one. Right. Back to the show.
Beverly is used to being ignored by the neighbors. They'd clung to her like curious birds in the aftermath of Henry's arrest. They were so sure, just as Beverly had been, that the police had arrested the wrong man. Poor Beverly, here's a casserole. Poor Beverly, I'll just stop by for a cup of coffee and we can have a good chat about it all. They wanted gossip, of course, and they gawped wide-eyed as she described helicopter blades, officers streaming in, spreading dirt across the carpets, the mess the cadaver dogs made of the roses in the yard. When it became clear that Henry, the heatwave killer, had in fact murdered 7 women, the birds retreated. Fast. If she was passing a neighbor as they were getting out of their car, they'd wait inside until she'd reached the end of the street. If someone was watering their lilacs and Beverly came out of her house to do the same, they'd put down their watering cans and slip wordlessly back inside. Accusations swirled around the street. Everyone had an opinion. She needs to go down as an accomplice, she'd hear them whisper. I don't understand how she's not as culpable as he is. There's no way in hell she didn't know.
Yeah, great. Beverly and her 2 other female friends who were married to serial killers, Elsie and Margot, are very distinct, different women. And you've said that they just sort of appeared to you and you just started writing. Did one of them appear slightly first? And did you have trouble writing any of them on the page?
Yeah, and I have said before that they came to me organically. But even then, you have a surface level idea of who a character is, and then little bits more come to you as you start writing. But I would say the first woman that came to me was probably Beverly. And I think that is likely because, to me, and in my opinion, Bev is a very good representation of how most women would respond to the news that their husband was a serial killer. And that is with shame and guilt and the idea that she should have stopped this happening and she should have known what was going on. I think we place a lot of pressure on women when it comes to things like women's intuition. I think we put too much weight on that and think, How did you not know what was going on? You should know exactly what your husband was doing. And Beverly has responded to that with a want for control and this almost terror for her children. She's a mother. I'm a mother. I have a young daughter. And so I think I can empathize with her in that way as well. You know, she really fears about the effect that this is going to have on her children. She worries that her son is going to have inherited the same rotten core as his father. And so I think she came to me easiest because she's sort of a baseline for how we might respond to the news that our husband had been doing these things. And then you have Elsie and Margot, who are two, extremes. The women are very different. Elsie has responded to her husband's crimes with, she's a dog with a bone, basically. She has a real thirst for facts, for knowledge. She wants to be a reporter in a newsroom. She works in a newsroom as a lowly assistant to the editor, but she longs to be the one sort of telling the story, finding out all the facts and telling the stories. And she, I think, is doing that because she doesn't want to miss anything again. She doesn't want to be bested by a man again. She doesn't want to be duped. And then we have Margot, who I suppose you could call Mrs. Bravado. She is very glamorous. She loves to attend a Hollywood party. Her husband was a politician, so she was part of being quite a powerful couple and going out to these social occasions. And she loves to throw on faux fur and sequins and go to a party and pretend that she is not at all affected by what her husband has done. But deep down, Margot is very vulnerable and very damaged as well. And so I think as a whole, the women are each a representation of the ways that we might respond. Did one of them? Yeah, Bev came easiest. Margot was the most fun to write because she says ridiculous things and she's funny. I also identify with parts of Elsie, that sort of need, that thirst for knowledge, that need for facts after having missed something so huge.
And then with Elsie, what I liked was you also saw what the times were like,
Yes.
how she couldn't be a reporter because she was a woman. She was sort of dismissed. So that was fun. That element.
And she was also a really good way, working in a newsroom. She was also a really good way to bring in 1960s current affairs. So there was a lot going on at this time that was very interesting. You had the civil rights movement, you had the Vietnam War, you had space exploration. But it's funny, isn't it, that you look at where we are now, and actually it's quite similar. We have anti-police marches, we have space exploration, just NASA sending astronauts up. We have wars around the world. So yes, the book is very much of its time, but I think it's also speaks to the fact that not that much has changed.
Right. And in the US, you have, in a way, women having less rights. We got a lot of rights, absolutely. I guess, post the 60s.
Yeah.
And now they're being taken away or...
Yeah, I mean, these women would have thought they were on the cusp of, liberation in terms of things like reproductive rights, access to contraception, things like that. They would have just started to be able to, in the right circumstances, access birth control. And now look where we are now look where we are in the US. Women at this time in 1966, they couldn't get a credit card if their husbands weren't there to sign off on it. And if you're single and not married, good luck to you. Women couldn't serve on juries at this time in many states of America because they were thought to be too fragile, too sensitive, not objective enough to serve justice. And it would take them away from where they were supposed to be, which was in the heart of the home, in the kitchen with the children. And so I really tried to write this into the novel. My women even talk about women in the 50s and how lucky they are compared to women in the 50s.
Right.
But actually, as a reader looking at it now, it was a very difficult time to be a woman.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was born in 62, and it's amazing to think how restrictive it was even in 66. I think, was it maybe in 68? I learned maybe then you could get your own credit card or something. Something happened in 68. But anyway, the other question I had was, you've got a lot of humor in this book. Was it hard juggling with your dark themes and your humor, getting the balance right between the two? Because you wouldn't normally think that you'd have so much humor in a book about serial killers.
No, and actually Margot was really good for this because she's very deadpan. She will say what people are thinking but are too scared to say. I have quite a dark sense of humor. My threshold for dark things is quite high. So actually when I edited this book with my editors, there was lots of stuff they wanted me to sort of rein in because they felt it was too
funny.
Yeah. But I didn't want this to be a cozy novel. I think cozy crime as a genre is great, but wasn't my intention for this book. But I did want there to be levity. I did want there to be humor. I did want there to be glamour and friendship and excitement, because yes, these women were married to murderers, but they're still women. You know, they still have lives and interests and passions and personalities. So I wanted that to be clear on the page too. And also, I just had a lot of fun writing the book. And I know that's quite an interesting thing to say about a book that's about murder. But as you've touched on, I wanted this to be a book about murder that you can read by the pool.
Right.
You know, a crime book that is also escapism, a book about killings as much as it is about female friendship. So I did want there to be a lot of humor throughout there, because I didn't just want it to be dreary.
Yeah. It's not dreary at all.
To be completely honest, when I was writing the book, I didn't think anybody was going to read it. I wasn't under contract. No one had asked for the book from me. My agent didn't know I was writing the book. So it was really just something that I wrote for me. And I thought, what would I really like to read? What do I find funny? What do I find interesting? Surely there are other people out there who will relate to those things too. But I think I gave myself a lot of freedom when I was writing the book, because I wasn't, I didn't have that sort of image of an editor breathing down my neck, no one tapping their watches. I wasn't thinking, where is this going to sit in a bookshelf, in a bookstore? What shelf is it going to be on?
Right.
I just sort of had fun and thought, I'm going to write the thing that I've never given myself permission to write before. And this is a book that I would write even if it wasn't going to be published, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And thinking you're going to write about the wives.
Yes. Yeah. And that was really came out of my fascination with true crime. But I found myself at a point drawn to a different sort of true crime story. So I sort of noticed that I was starting to listen to a lot of podcasts, watch a lot of documentaries, read a lot of material about people who are adjacent to violent crime and people who are sort of left to deal with the trauma of it and deal with the aftermath of it. And as I started delving into these people's stories more, particularly the women, the wives, the daughters, the sisters, I got really angry on their behalf. I really felt that they had been so disempowered by the worst thing that somebody else had ever done and left to live the rest of their lives defined by a terrible thing done by somebody that they lived in the same house as. And so I started to get really angry, and I thought, how can I give, in a fictional sense, how can I give these people back some agency? How can I give them power? How can I let them have fun? And how can I let them give these men their comeuppance? Because I think as women, we're so often left to apologize for the actions of men, deal with the fallout of the actions of men. And so I approached this book with anger as much as anything,
Wow. Very good. Yeah, I guess sometimes when you hear about like a bomb or something in the US, I'm always sort of like, what's going on at home with the parents?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's a really interesting dynamic as well. The parents of
I probably place a little more blame. I wouldn't on the wives, but on the parents, I'm always like, how did you not know your son was planning all this? Because it's usually always men.
Sometimes they do know, and they try to raise
the alarm.
Raise the alarm. There was a really horrible crime here in the UK and in Southport. I think it was Southport. And a man went into a Taylor Swift dance. You may have heard of it in the States. Taylor Swift dance class, and killed some young girls who were participating in that dance. They were young.
Oh, right.
His parents had raised concerns about him, and I think one of his teachers had raised concerns about him, and these things slipped through the net.
Oh,
so
right.
It's really difficult. So hard. And I think I've been asked this question on a podcast before, actually. What would I do if I found out that my husband was doing this? And I think with a husband, I would take my child and I would tell the police what was going on. I've got an identical twin sister. If you ask me about that dynamic, if I found out that my twin sister had done something, that's a different thing. And so I do think that family,
Right.
not that I would excuse any killing, let's say, but I do think being a wife, not being related by blood, being able to actually have that objectivity gave my women the freedom to give these men their comeuppance.
Yeah, no, I love the way they figured it out. And also the whole point about you had one mother who had two children and she was worried about her son.
Yes.
That's something that these women must worry about, because what made that person a serial killer, and was it passed down?
That's the thing, and I think it depends where you stand on the nature versus nurture debate. And I think it's sort of generally thought that it's partly nature, but there are things in nurture that trigger. So it's almost like epigenetics. So you have to have the susceptibility there, and then there's a certain set of societal circumstances or things that happen as these men grow up that sort of switch those genes on and allow that behavior to come to the surface. So it's no one or the other.
Right. And you mentioned the war.
Sorry. Yes.
You mentioned the war.
Yes.
Breeding.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many interesting arguments. There's a really interesting book called Murderland, I think it's called. Yeah, up on my shelf there, Murderland. And that argues that there's a very specific part of the Pacific Northwest where there's a lot of serial killer activity. And it was argued that it was because there was sort of pollutants in the water from certain big factories, around there. So there are so many interesting arguments as to what can. And then there's the head injury argument. Many people argue that if you've had a traumatic brain injury in childhood and, that changes your brain and your personality. If you look at, this is an argument, I'm not saying this is definitely the case, but if you look at some serial killers like Fred West here in the UK, he had a very bad motorcycle accident. Richard Ramirez, I think it was hit in the head by a swing. There's so much interesting research. There's so many interesting, arguments as to what makes these men monsters.
Yeah.
But I think it's absolutely a sort of perfect storm, a collection of multiple factors.
You mentioned that you had this freedom when you were writing this, and now you are under a book contract, I understand, for your next book.
Yes.
So is there a way to harness that freedom when you do have a contract so you can just not think about the editor on your shoulder?
No, I don't think there is, to be completely honest. I wish I could think of some sort of tip for people who are struggling with books under contract, but it's just the nature of the beast. I found the writing of this next book completely different to my experience with writing The Secret Lives of Murderous Wives. I don't think that will show on the page. I don't think that if something is difficult to write, it makes it worse or, I can look at pages of my manuscript, my work in progress, and forget that I found a bit really, really difficult to write, or that something took me days to write. But it certainly is a different experience. Just knowing that, just having that sort of editor on your shoulder is a completely different experience.
Maybe your first draft will be more complete than the first draft with.
What I do have to keep reminding myself of is that no one's going to read the first draft, because the first draft is always going to be terrible. So I do have that freedom in the first draft of it just being awful. So there is that little bit of wiggle room there where I'm, writing thinking, oh God, this is terrible, but it doesn't matter. This is just for me. I will edit it. It will be edited multiple times before it goes to my editors. But I look back on that time, of writing this book as something really joyful and freeing And I just feel grateful to have had that experience. Maybe if I fall out of contract again, there'll be another one of those moments. But it is a privilege to be under contract, I would say.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's harder and it's a less, it's a less free and flowing experience.
Right.
But hopefully that won't show in the end product.
I'm sure it won't. And when you have a book under contract and they love The Secret Lives, did they give you any stipulations as to what it needs to be about, or it can be anything?
It can be anything. And we went through 8 ideas.
Oh.
Yeah. So we went through a lot of different ideas trying to find the right one. And that process took almost a year.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So there was definitely the sort of notion that it needed to feel like a big book in the way that Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives felt like a big, a big hook, a big idea.
Yeah.
A book club style read, something with emotional heft, something with unique characters, and probably that involved crime. But that was really it, in terms of where the parameters were. So it took a long time to settle on the right idea, but I'm glad that we have, and I'm nearly there.
Great.
It's going to be interesting to see how that goes.
Does it have crime?
Yes, it does.
It does have crime.
Yes.
But maybe it'll be similar to this in that you don't have to be a crime reader to enjoy it.
Absolutely. And that is really what I would say about The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives. Yes, it is a thriller. Yes, it is a crime novel, but it's also it's also a book about the resilience of women. It's a book about surviving trauma, but it's also a book about Hollywood and early 60s music and fashion and 3 really interesting women in unique circumstances. So yes, absolutely. That's what I'm gunning for with the next one.
I mean, I loved it. I don't think of myself as, I don't really read mysteries or true crime, but I've forgotten this was so suspenseful that I really enjoyed the pace of it. Actually, and I just remembered I interviewed the man who wrote a book called The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell. And he normally, Robert Dugoni, he normally does crime books, and this one isn't. But he said he felt like his crime books helped influence this. So the writing is very sharp and fast, and there's plot.
Yes, short chapters, plot, cliffhangers at the end of things. That, you're going to find all of that there. But within it, there's also a sort of meatier look at other topics too.
Exactly. Yeah. Nature, relationships, women, and a little Hollywood. I don't know if this is the case, but Elsie, so she's fighting to be taken seriously in the newsroom. Did you model her after any real live journalists at the time?
Oh, hell yes. Peggy from Mad Men.
Oh.
No, I watched a lot of Mad Men when researching this book, which was no hard task at all.
Yeah, no.
And she was very much by
I love it.
Peggy from Mad Men. And also there's a really good film actually about the Boston Strangler that takes place at a similar sort of time, and Keira Knightley plays a journalist in that. And that was really interesting to watch while I was writing it as well. And I'd recommend people watch that film because it's actually very good. But yeah, I mean, I certainly did channel, shamelessly the Mad Men vibes for those chapters, because you've got an office filled with terribly misogynistic men and some really
drinking.
Drinking a lot, and some really powerful women in there. So
nice.
She's modeled on
So interspersed throughout the novel are these short ticking. I'm not going to give anything away, but these ticking clock chapters. 2 days missing, 10 days missing, and so on, that really wind the suspense even tighter on what's already a propulsive read. Did you always know that you'd use that device to crank up the tension, or did it arrive partway through the drafting?
I always had them, and I had to fight for them to stay.
Oh, I'm glad they stayed.
I think so too. It was for that purpose, to sort of ratchet up the tension, but also those chapters act as a sort of every woman voice. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's a spoiler to say that those chapters are a woman who has been taken and is being held captive, while using them to, as a sort of ticking time bomb device. They're also used to describe the general experience of being a woman, and the general experience of being a woman suffering violence at the hands of a man. but also just the everyday general experience of living as a woman. In those chapters, where I talk about, women having to think about their safety every second of the day. And even now I can go on Instagram and see people talking about having to think about their exact path when they're leaving their car and going to their front door.
Mm-hmm.
Having to reroute at night to go in a different direction because the path that they were going to take wasn't well lit enough. That's still things that we live with as women today. And there's still that sort of constant calculation, that weighing up of risk, that multiple decision-making in every aspect of our lives that is to do with risk. And that risk exists because of violence against women and male violence against women. So that was also a reason why I fought for them to stay. I thought they were an device to keep the pace going, but also I wanted to use them, as a way to speak about the universal experience of living as a woman.
I get these reels, and I got a reel. I was saying that this decision of a woman saved her life, and she got into an Uber. I think these are true stories. She got into an Uber, and the man said, and she left a club with all her friends, and the Uber driver said to her, aren't you a party of two? And she thought she could easily have just said, no, it's just me. But she looked on her phone and she's like, he knows it's just me because that's what I said. It's just one person. And she just trusted her instinct and got out of the car. And the police told her later they do that to make sure that no one's waiting for you, that you won't be missed. So if you just say, no, it's just me, they know that they're free. But if you say that, no, there's another person coming, they're not going to do anything. So it's a trick question because they know you're only one person.
That's just getting home. That is just getting from A to B and having to make almost a life or death decision based on that. A man wouldn't have to do that. My husband wouldn't have to wouldn't have to get in an Uber and think, do I need to get out of this Uber in order to save my life? It's just very different experience.
My husband never thinks of stuff like that. He doesn't understand when I'm like, let's walk on the other side of the street. Why?
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Oh, since the book came out, have you ever heard from any women whose lives have actually been touched by this? Wives, daughters, sisters? Oh, yeah.
No, I haven't, but that would be fascinating. But I have heard from lots of women who have felt very represented by the book in terms of, as we were just discussing, the experience of having to live with that sort of threat of violence and things like that. So that's been really nice. And it's been really interesting to hear from readers in terms of what they take from the story and what they see the story as. You never know what your story really is until people start reading it.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting experience to hear from them. And I don't look at my reviews though, I must say, because I just preserve I haven't for any of my books, because that is a decision that I've made.
Yeah, it's kind of smart.
Lovely. And I really appreciate that. And that's really nice. And if it's reviewed in papers or things like that, then I will. But Goodreads is something that I avoid until I've, encouraged my fellow authors to avoid. But that's a personal decision, and each to their own on that front.
I think that's smart. Okay. Well, that's all my questions. Thank you, Elizabeth. This was fascinating. I really, maybe everybody's a little bit interested in serial killers. And I love your original take on it and the way that it's, as I said at the beginning, it's so many things, this book.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was so nice to chat.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening. I loved how Elizabeth knows her subject matter so well. Not just the psychological profile of serial killers, but also what goes on in the minds of their wives who didn't see it coming and then have to live with the trauma and the public shaming when they did nothing wrong. Elizabeth also addresses the constant awareness that women must have to stay safe, from choosing not to walk down a dark path to not opening the door to a stranger or getting in the wrong Uber. So while this book is a fun, suspenseful read, it also touches on some more serious issues that are worth pondering. If you enjoyed the podcast, which I hope you did, you could support the show by becoming a paid subscriber on Substack. It makes a real difference and means we can keep bringing you fascinating conversations like this one. Everything you need to know is in the show notes. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.